And now the plenary session 2, GX Together, shall commence. First of all, I would like to introduce 3 moderators for this session. Mr. John David Moore, Dr. Hoesung Lee, Dr. Eija-Riitta Korhola. Mr. John David Moore is ICEF Steering Committee, Chief Executive Officer of Bloomberg NEF. Dr. Hoesung Lee is ICEF Steering Committee, former chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and Chair Professor of Graduate School of Energy and Environment, Korea University. Dr. Eija-Riitta Korhola is ICEF Steering Committee Delegate of the Consultative Commission for Industrial Change European Economic and Social Committee. Now I would like to ask Mr. Moore to moderate this session. Mr. Moore, if you please.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. The topic we're going to talk about this afternoon is GX Together, so the green transformation together. Really about the just transition, I think, is the phrase that most people use. So the good news is we're now in the net zero era, so we now have a lot of commitments towards decarbonization, around mid-century. But that brings with it some, as was mentioned earlier today, potentially some unintended consequences. So what does the just transition really mean? And for the purposes of our panel today, it's really about sharing the benefits and burdens of the transition equally and without leaving anybody behind. So it's how do we do this in a just and fair way? And we're really going to focus on 3 different areas of this question. The first is around geography. So people often use the just transition when they're thinking about how different countries and different, particularly as relates to the global south and how to include them in the transition. It also relates to sectors and how to support and help the transition of particularly fossil fuel-centric industries, how to bring those communities with us. And finally, we're going to talk about finance, because at the end of the day, not much happens without money. So we're really going to talk about how the financial aspects fit in. So that's really the structure we're going to take this afternoon. And I'd also add that it's not just important from the just transition, not just important from a moral perspective, but also I think in terms of actually achieving the transition, we really do have to bring everybody with us, because the people that aren't brought with us will be a drag and an impediment. And so it's actually in all of our interests to really be very inclusive and bring all communities and all countries along with us. So we have this afternoon a very wide, knowledgeable, diverse panel. Dr. Lee has already been introduced, and he is going to, is a co-moderator, and is going to summarize at the end some of the topics of discussion that we will have. And then we'll have Dr. Eija-Riitta Korhola, who is going to give us a European perspective, actually, and is an advisor on European affairs and has a long history in this topic. We're going to have Dr. Yamaguchi Shinobu, or Yumi, so thank you for joining us, who is Director of the United Nations University Institute for the Advanced Study for Sustainability. Sounds a perfect topic for this afternoon. Next to her, we have Mr. Humphrey Mrema, who is chairman of the Youth Survival Organization and Youth for Climate Advisory Committee member. So thank you for joining us. And also online on the screen, we have Mr. Andrew Jeffries, who is advisor on the Energy Transition Mechanism, the ETM, and partnerships for the Energy Sectors Office at the Asian Development Bank. And also Mr. ISHIKAWA Tomohiro, or Tomo for short, who is the Chief Regulatory Engagement Officer for MUFG Group. So again, we have a good representation of different geographies, different backgrounds, finance included in that. So with that, what I'm going to do is we're going to have a few opening statements to really set some ideas rolling. With that, I'm going to hand over to Eija to start that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone.
As a former politician, I start with some general reflections from the past decades. From the time I started as a lawmaker in climate and energy in 1999 in the European Parliament. The Kyoto Protocol had only recently been adopted, and of course I was a firm supporter of it. However, in my role as a legislator, I began to recognize some weaknesses. The agreement was valuable as an expression of political will, but as a matter of fact, there was a risk that the Kyoto Protocol would increase greenhouse gas emissions if, as a result of the agreement, industrial production is transferred to countries where less strict emission norms apply. The threat of carbon leakage was to be taken seriously. As long as production and not consumption-based emissions are the basis of any climate agreement, there is a great chance of self-deception. Emissions reductions can be explained by an increase in imports from places where no serious climate actions are taken. On the other hand, we had to think of climate justice. This led in discourse to a division into survival and luxury emissions. According to this division, carbon dioxide emission units had, depending on their background, a different moral weight and level of blame. You had to take into consideration that, for instance, the emissions generated by the Indian middle class were higher than the average. On the other hand, again, the atmosphere has no moral sensors which would distinguish between the so-called luxury and survival emissions. Their consequences are the same. I became to understand that climate issue is a so-called wicked problem. Politicians are increasingly dealing with problems which are wicked or super wicked. These are systemic, self-fueling tangles of problems which get out of hands and easily generate new problems with new when one tries to solve the old ones. For this reason, the attempted solutions may cause unintended consequences and harmful effects. Nowadays, I see energy as a key question. Just a century ago, life was backbreaking. Weather-related disasters killed 500,000 people each year. Today, despite rising temperatures, but because of less poverty and more resilience, droughts, floods, hurricanes and extreme temperatures kill just 20,000 people each year, a reduction of 95%. That is a morally commendable achievement. Plentiful energy, mostly from fossil fuels, doubled the life expectancy. It has lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty in just past 25 years. You didn't have to spend hours collecting firewood, polluting your household with smoke. You achieved heat, cold, transportation, light, food and opportunities. Better life and more liberties for women too. This is our challenge in just transition. Green energy is simply not yet in a place in its development where it could take over what fossil fuels leave behind. A hard transition would cause a real global catastrophe, sending most of us back into backbreaking poverty. That's why developing countries especially want more fossil fuel power, not less. Plentiful energy means well-being. It is understandable. We have to realize just how different the current move to renewables is from past energy transitions. Almost every time a society has replaced one source of energy with another, it has shifted to a more reliable and more energy-dense fuel. This time, however, simply replacing fossil fuels with renewables would mean moving to fuels that are less reliable and more diffuse, for a while at least. What we need now is low CO2 energy that can outcompete fossil fuels, which would make everyone, including China and India, switch. This means dramatically increasing global investment into clean research and development, something that we have strikingly failed to do these past decades, partly because activists have consistently demanded solutions before they are ready. More than nostalgia and politics of limitation, we need innovation. And that's why we are in the right forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about energy throughout the discussion. So Yumi, please, from a United Nations perspective.
And thank you, Chair. Thank you very much. And good afternoon, everyone, and distinguished delegate. I am very much honored to be addressing you at this very important meeting today. Actually, I just came back from the SDG Summit in New York, where our Secretary General of the United Nations highlighted, in fact, a very sad news that the only 15% of our target, the goal of the SDG, were on track to be achieved. And we are in the middle of the Agenda 2030. Right? And we have only achieved 15%. Therefore, we do need the stronger solidarity and across the society to make a significant impact on the progress toward the sustainable future. That is very much obvious. And in such a critical situation, I really believe that just transition can be a breakthrough, the solution for achieving the multiple SDGs simultaneously, because the just transition embodies the principle of leaving no one behind during the transition to the greener world. In fact, it is very important to recognize, as the moderator has mentioned, that this concept emphasizes the equitable distribution of the both benefit and burden. To ensure that every single member of the society participate in and the benefit from the sustainability, the transformation. And it is actually not just important, but it is very much essential, for the achieving a climate equity and economic, social, and environmental sustainability. With the United Nations University, and actually we are very happy to representing the research community here today, because our recommendation, our statement are very, very much based on our research, based on the evidences. So we are very much focusing on supporting the vulnerable population in the transition to net zero emissions. In principle, the government must play a key role in promoting the universal access to decarbonize the technologies and practices. They should really focus on the two major points. One, identifying vulnerable the energy users and enhancing support measures for such population. And two, placing inclusion at the center of the national strategies, especially for developing countries. This is very much essential to manage the unintended, unequal, and unjustifiable, unjust effect on vulnerable populations. And actually, our studies were reflected in Think 7 Task Force issue paper prepared for the G7 countries and partners early this year. So I wish to emphasize quickly the 4 recommendations from this paper. The first, it is very important to strengthen the social safety net, particularly for the workers in carbon-intensive industries to mitigate disruptions caused by the transition. Now, of course, challenges are found in the countries with limited implementation of the social protection systems as a part of climate strategies to reduce the inequalities. But at the same time, we have found the good practices as the government combined climate initiatives with the social protection measures to maintain an adequate standard of living for all. For instance, the Philippines removed the energy subsidies and instead introduced the energy taxes with the electricity discount with the senior citizens, for example, and cash transfers for the marginalized groups, and the public transport assistance program. So there are very much precise and concrete examples we have found. Second, it is very important to promote the employability and continuing education, reskilling and training. Our multiple studies suggest the government should to promote engineering and managerial skills and training for energy-related industries and broader sustainability and transitions. Fiji, for example, is greening its national technical vocational education and training, the programs that focuses on the renewable energy and the resilience. And Tuvalu is strengthening its education sector's resilience to natural disasters and climate change. And these examples are very important, really, to influence the other similar the countries the facing the difficult the problems. And third, it is very important to commit to increasing the national budget allocations for climate finance and mobilize the public and private finance the flows. Our case studies indicate that private investment in low carbon projects can be incentivized through the tax breaks and support for greener the bond and the establishing a green bank. For example, China's green credit policy and its guidelines to incentivize banks to provide the finance for the green-related project are regarded as a very practical, a good example. Another example in Indonesia, where the government has expanded its ministerial climate budget tagging mechanism to include the gender response climate budgeting since 2020. So that has been very much exemplified in the region in Asian Pacific. And last of all, and most importantly, it is very significant to establish the people-centered and gender-sensitive monitoring, reporting, and evaluating the process. This requires policymakers to improve their understanding of diversity and marginalized groups to determine how their rights can be protected. And it really involves local community participation to reflect their need, actually to empower the communities to shape the inclusive strategies. One example from Thailand mapped the climate risks for the children to develop child-sensitive climate policy, and Bangladesh prioritized the collection of the data on age, gender, and disability for its national adaptation plans. So I think we have really found, challenges, but at the same time, good examples that we can really refer to prioritize those vulnerable population. And definitely our journey toward the sustainability and climate equity is complex, but that we must undertake it together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yumi. And yeah, great to have those 4 points sort of mapped out for us. So thank you very much for that. Now we're going to move online, actually, and we have a video, actually a video address from Andrew Jeffries from the Asian Development Bank. So if we can play the video, please, that will be great.
Thank you to the ICEF organizers for inviting me to participate in this green transformation session. My name is Andrew Jeffries, and I'm an advisor on just energy transition initiatives at the Asian Development Bank. The ADB is a multilateral development bank mandated to assist our developing member countries in the Asia and Pacific region by providing loans, technical assistance, grants, and equity investments to promote social and economic development. We have ambitious climate goals, including reaching $100 billion of climate investments throughout the region by 2030, as we seek to be the region's climate bank. We have recently undergone an internal reorganization intended to maximize our internal human resources to upscale our operations to meet these ambitions. Now, to address this session's green transformation topic, I'll begin by saying that there are different ways to view the just transition. At the country level and at the community level, this transition has implications for many whose livelihoods depend on fossil fuels or otherwise carbon-intensive activities that may be altered or phased out over time. This could also affect the overall well-being of entire communities where these activities occur. There is thus an important need to address the destabilizing nature of such a transition. Now, from a wider global perspective, many developing countries have rapidly expanding economies, and their carbon footprints are equally, if not faster, growing. And this is a valid concern for overall global carbon emissions. But keep in mind that the per capita carbon emissions of some of these countries remain well below that of developed countries. And the huge cost of their energy transitions may have when they have lower per capita incomes, higher incidences of poverty, and less developed capital mobilizing capabilities and other tools make it harder for them and more challenging to meet this transition. Developed countries have relatively lower economic growth rates and relatively flat energy demand, so they can focus on decarbonizing their existing energy systems over time. But rapidly growing developing economies face the twin challenges of meeting rapid energy demand growth, a huge challenge in and of itself, and on top of that, simultaneously decarbonizing. As an example, a country with 7 to 8% energy demand growth needs to double its energy supply infrastructure within 10 years just to keep the lights on. And then they'll need to double it yet again over the following 10 years. They could thus be doing many of the very difficult and challenging and innovative activities that a developed country is doing, which would be hard enough. But given the simultaneously demand growth, their overall emissions may be staying flat or even growing slightly, while those of developed countries could be falling. Also, it's a huge ask if you expect them to curb their economic growth and their progress on improving their people's livelihoods and living standards. So, because of this, the developed world has a responsibility to recognize and acknowledge these different circumstances and thus to help provide solutions accordingly. Now, on the topic of the role of the financial sector for an inclusive transition, the investment needs are so large that the financial sector must mobilize massive amounts of capital over an extended period. And the required investments need to be spread across scaling established technologies, but also into early stage funding of new emerging technologies that can help with the decarbonization efforts. So from commercial banks to private equity investors in new technologies and other capital providers, all have a very large role to play in this transition. Now, as a representative of a multilateral development bank, our role includes not just providing our own investments, but more important is to help mobilize private investment to the maximum of extent possible. So we can help accomplish this through working with our developing member countries and our development partners through policy dialogue to create the enabling environment to facilitate scaled-up climate investments. And it also involves making efficient and strategic use of concessional funding sources to support the transition. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak, and I look forward to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andrew touched on lots of different points relevant to growth and decarbonization. And now I move to Tomo from MUFG for some opening comments.
John, do you hear me okay? Just want to make sure.
Yeah, we can, loud and clear. Thanks.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you very much. So first of all, apologies for not being there. I'm, of course, based in Tokyo, but I've been traveling, so apologies for joining from Berlin, where I am today. And also, thank you very much for having me on this panel. So let me give you a bit of a context and who we are, what we are doing, what are the challenges we are facing. So I represent MUFG. I'm a Chief Regulatory Engagement Officer, dealing with policymakers, but also net zero initiatives like GPAN's Net Zero Banking Alliance, et cetera, which I'll come back to later on. But we, MUFG, we're the largest financial institution based in Japan, but we have extensive footprint in Asia, in Europe, US, et cetera, So we're not just Japanese institution, we want to say we're global, but extensive footprint in emerging economies, ASEAN included. We, MUFG, committed to net zero by 2050. This was 2.5 years ago, and since then we learned a lot, actually. And I personally learned a lot how we deal with this challenge. What are the, how can we address this huge funding gap that we've been hearing? But I just want to also add the unique challenge that the financial institutions are facing. As most of you know, when it comes to net zero by 2050, for financial institutions, we're talking about finance emission. So we don't, manufacture goods directly. We finance our clients. So in the context of net zero, we are talking about what we call finance emission or indirect emission. So we need to facilitate our client net zero as opposed to only pursuing our net zero. And again, I'll come back to this later, given it's a partnership that we need to build with our clients. MUFG, given we committed to net zero, we've been very much involved in the discussion at GPANS, which was created 2.5 years ago before COP in Glasgow. We are also a member of Net Zero Banking Alliance. We committed to net zero following the Net Zero Banking Alliance guideline. And I sit on the steering group of Net Zero Banking Alliance and working on transition finance framework and guidelines there. We're also very much involved in JETP, Just Energy Transition Partnership, that the G7 launched, I think it was last year under German presidency. And we're also very much involved in creating an enabling environment of blended finance that we heard from Andrew a little bit a few minutes ago. But this blended finance is critical because many of these projects in ASEAN countries are not bankable, but we need a public institution to de-risk so that private institution like MUFG can mobilize finance. But in the context of a just transition, John, you mentioned about just transition. I also want to spend a few minutes talking about how we should think about just transition from a practitioner's perspective. We, private institution, we always want to think about how we can practically implement these concepts. And I assume when it comes to just transition, it's, of course, an extremely important topic, but presumably no one disagrees with the notion of just transition. And when, this is my former boss told me, when nobody disagrees or nobody argues against one idea, then either framing of the question is wrong or we are asking the question to the wrong audience. So perhaps asking just transition isn't the right question, but rather how should one assess the degree of just transition is the right question. And I want to unpack that. Let me first of all discuss what the outcome we want to achieve. And we often discuss the notion of stranded asset. Stranded asset is the term refers to the risk that certain type of assets being stranded or value being depleted due to the development of government policies such as carbon tax, and the typical example is coal power plants, as we've been hearing from Andrew as well. Stranded asset is a problem, especially for financial institutions, because we will face losses when the assets on our balance sheet is depleted. Having said this, a stranded asset is a financial issue. So while painful and could be contained, but it could be contained if we do not trigger financial instability, i.e. if we can do orderly transition, this risk of stranded asset can be contained or managed. However, if we created stranded humans, that's a problem. If transition to a low carbon economy ends up creating stranded human or people, we have a problem, and that's where I want to focus on. The question is, how can we deal with this? And also, who can address it? As a private financial institution with sizable balance sheet, indeed we have $3 trillion of balance sheet on our book, and with existing exposure to all sectors in Japan, but also across Asian countries, the notion we are suggesting is whole of economy transition. Here again, nobody may be willing to push back the notion of whole of economy transition, but this is in fact depending on how you look at it, it could be a controversial topic. Why? If we want to limit the global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees, and of course we're committed to do that, the idea often discussed is we should only finance those companies that are aligned or will be aligned in the near future with the 1.5 degrees trajectory. This approach basically suggests that you do not support the entities that cannot meet 1.5 degrees approach. And while this may sound reasonable, the question is, how do we deal with the risk of creating stranded human? The analogy I often use is the iceberg. Companies that can meet 1.5 degree scenario is the tip of the iceberg, just tip of it, right? And clearly, we should support transition of those in this category, those that can align with 1.5 degree scenario. But what about the rest of the iceberg is the question. We all know that millions of people are working in this sector that cannot easily adapt to 1.5 degree scenario, and we cannot leave them stranded. In fact, in the recent publication called Transition White Paper, which we, MUFG, published about 10 days ago, where we outline how Japan and Japanese companies are delivering net zero, we need to think about energy securities and also industrial competitiveness in mind, thinking about just an orderly transition. And we stress in this white paper that our net zero strategy can only be achieved through the entire economy achieving net zero, not just pursuing our balance sheet green net zero. So some may argue that we are too generous to high-emitting sectors, or that we are suggesting engaging greenwashing. But as a responsible financial institution, I do not think cherry-picking the winner and creating stranded human is the right approach. And of course, I'd love to hear your reactions, but basically what I'm trying to say is, let's make sure we're not just creating winner and forget about losers, but how can we facilitate entire economy, entire workers to transition to net zero society. That's what I wanted to basically stress in the opening intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, and for raising the all economy transition with no stranded humans. I think that's a great concept. Humphrey, so you've heard four people speak. How does that sound? And please share your thoughts.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, as I have been introduced, I'm so privileged to be here. I have traveled more than 10,000 miles all the way from Tanzania. And thank you so much for the support from the Secretariat and all stakeholders in order to make sure that youth voices are also represented. As young people in our gatherings, we usually say that there is nothing about us without us. You can't speak about young people if they are not there. So the fact that I'm here, it's a testament of the forum gathering youth voices and making sure that we are also being heard and our voices are amplified for sustainability. My presentation and my opening statement will focus more on how we can realize inclusive just transition so as to empower young people in the Global South, in Sub-Saharan Africa, and also in the developing economies as general. I think it was last year we had a meeting with some people working at the World Bank country office in Tanzania. And they told us that they received a proposal from the government of building a university, which will be IT-tailored university in Tanzania. So the staffs from World Bank wanted to know my views and opinions on that. I said that, like, young people, it's not the fact of number of universities we are having, but it is about quality of education, access to education, as well as the curriculums that will cater for the needs and also possessing contemporary skills that we are having. Resonating to that discussion, as we are speaking about just transition, the International Labour Organization tells us that it's only 9% of youth in Sub-Saharan Africa have tertiary education, which is actually indispensable in accelerating renewable energy solutions. As a matter of fact, by 2021, Africa has only 43% of internet penetration. This implies that more than 57% of the population have no access to internet. And at the same time, more than 600 million people in Africa have no access to reliable energy and electricity. When we are speaking about just transition, it resonates deeply with me. As Africans, we face these kind of challenges. And I have come with 3 recommendations that have to be taken into account. First and foremost, investing in education and training. According to the report provided by the World Economic Forum, it says that by 2025, more than 50% of workers have to be reskilled, because most of the skills that they are possessing will become obsolete. Here we are speaking about those who are employed. What about young people who don't have employment? The situation is more worse. Knowledge gap in Africa and in Global South is increasing proportionally with population. So the first and foremost avenue and solution to be taken is to invest in education and training. And this has to be mostly focused on green skills. There are 7 green skills which are more contemporary to young people, and they are also important. Just to list them and outline them. First, it's renewable energy. Second, it's energy efficiency. Third is waste management. Fourth is smart agriculture. Fifth is green building and architecture. Sixth is environmental policy and advocacy. And the 7th is environmental monitoring and assessment. Young people have to be empowered with these contemporary skills so as to ensure green jobs. And green jobs drives me to my second point. We need to create more jobs. According to the International Labour Organization, they reported that renewable energy can create 3 times jobs more than fossil fuel. So in order to make sure that young people, we are the primary beneficiaries of these new jobs in the renewable energy, first we need green skills. These green skills will help us to have green jobs. So for example, we have our colleague from Mitsubishi can decide to say, like, we are establishing an innovation hub in Africa. We want to have a technological center in East Africa that first will initiate exchange programs, Japanese to learn from Africa, and of course, Africans to learn from you. After then, we make sure that these skills are employable, to make sure that the population which is increasing of young people in Africa, they all have employment and jobs so as to create revenues. I want to reiterate what was discussed and agreed during the TICAD summit last year in Tunis, Tunisia. TICAD 8 declaration says that Japan and its government, as well as other stakeholders, are committed to support Africa in economic diversification, particularly through promoting young and women entrepreneurs. This is what we want to hear. This is what we want to see. We need people to walk the talk. And the last is access to finance. There have been a lot of debates about climate finance, and unfortunately until today, there is no universal definition of climate finance. Africa is disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change. And statistics shows it's only 1% of climate financing in the world is allocated in Africa. What are we doing to fill this finance gap? Why don't we initiate some strategic investments in Africa that can employ young people? For example, River Nile, the source of River Nile is Lake Victoria. Lake Victoria is shared by 3 countries. It's among the largest lakes in Africa and particularly in the world. It is shared by Kenya, it is shared by Uganda, it is shared by Tanzania. River Nile helps people in Egypt more than how Lake Victoria helps people in Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya. Where is the challenge? The challenge is skills, the challenge is finance. To share like a real example of a supply chain of a young entrepreneur in Africa selling vegetables. He will wake up in the morning, take private transport to the office where he or she works, and this private transport uses fossil fuel. He goes to the office, he uses refrigerators to keep the vegetables fresh. Refrigerators pollute methane, which add carbon gases and greenhouse gases, including methane. At the same time, because of unreliable electricity and energy in Africa, there will be power cut. He will be necessitated to purchase a generator. This generator uses fossil fuel. At the same time, a client calls, I need this quantity of vegetable to my house. The supplier will use motorbike to deliver the vegetables. Motorbike uses fossil fuel. How can you preach just transition to this kind of a person? We need subsidization of clean energy sources. We need policies that will support. We need like tax relief. And this is how we can lead by example. To lastly reiterate, this conversation has to continue and making sure that more young people are included, are involved, and are empowered. As I said, there is nothing about us without us. I rest my case.
Thank you very much for those clear 3 points. And I'm going to use that as a starting point to talk about geographies, actually. And I'd like to ask Yumi a little bit about training. You talked about people-centered development, reskilling. Do you want to say a little bit more about how you think about, particularly for developing countries, the ideas that you've seen and things that have worked and what you think we should be including in our plans?
Thank you. And thank you very much for this very important question. I am very much intrigued by my neighbor's statement about this educational practices, not only in the greener the industries, but the overall reskilling and the training. And in fact, according to the UNESCO's the recent study, by 2030, so 7 years from now, 2/3 of the current existing job will not be available. Okay, this means actually it's not only the youth in Africa's the problem, or the staff or the people in the developing countries, but also people in the developed country has to really face how we can really reskill ourselves and to have a continuing education to make society greener and resilient. And actually, I had a very interesting dialogue between the carbon-intensive industries, the people, okay, and those who are promoting the greener society at the COP27 last year in Egypt. And that was actually the example, not from developing countries, but developed countries from Germany. There was a dialogue on the group of the people who really was raised in the community of the carbon-intensive industry, who believe this is our future and this is our the way to live. Whereas the German government was very much promoting the greener industries. So what was really important was to have what is the expectation of the society and what really doesn't exist there to assist those professionals who really supported the carbon-intensive industries. And that was really the specific, the government support, including the finance, to reskill and retrain those people. And eventually, there was a very good example of the German government of the supporting those youth, young professionals, with the different options, being trained, being reskilled, to contribute to the environment-friendly industries, including those eco and tourism, or the working in green infrastructure and supporting in the better the environment in place of those carbon-intensive industries. So I think those continuous reskilling, retraining, and for not only the carbon-intensive industry, but the vulnerable population really has to be decentralized, the policy of the government, not only developing the countries, but the developed countries. If we really want to have a transition to the greener, the economy, with the, involving everyone to participate. So that's one of my, the examples that I wish to share. Thank you.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Have you seen ways where there's been transfer across countries, though? Because if we wait for every country to devise its own training program, then given most of these technologies sort of global in nature, it feels like an ideal way of transferring skills and setting up training programs sort of across countries. Have you seen that?
Yeah, actually, one quick example, I am not bragging about the global network, but the United Nations University, our institute, has a the regional network called the ProsperNet, the promotion of sustainable development in education. So we have 55 universities collaborating in 15 countries in Asian Pacific. And there, the different experts in the university, they collaborate in producing the joint curriculum and promoting climate action and climate change, discussing climate change issues. And those curriculum can be utilized by the professional of the university, which normally doesn't happen because curriculum in higher education is very country specific. But with the United Nations University being an international organization can promote that kind of regional collaboration. And I'm certain that South-South the collaboration can be promoted between Asian Pacific and Africa, so that those exemplified curriculum can be explored in an African continent and beyond. Thank you.
Yeah, that seems like a great thing to focus on, because so much reskilling needs to happen around the globe that we should leverage each other's knowledge as much as possible. I'm going to also refer to Humphrey's third point about access to finance. And as Humphrey quite rightly pointed out, less than 1%, I think, is invested, of the global investment in renewable energy went into Africa, which, considering it's 1.3 billion people, is a pretty shocking statistic. So I'm going to ask Tomo. You talked about not having any stranded humans and you know, helping all economy transition. How do you think about investing in some of these developing economies to improve that investment ratio?
Sure. Thank you very much. So let me discuss how we are, why JETP, for example, Just Energy Transition Partnership is important and why we need to focus on energy transition as kind of a high priority agenda, and then talk about the role of private finance. So if you look at the emission profile of Asian countries, whether it's Indonesia, Vietnam, et cetera, almost 50% of CO2 is coming from electricity and heat. So, and by the way, that number is much lower in other developed countries. For example, I think France, we're talking about like 13% or so, UK 20+%, US I think was 30+%. So for Asia, because the CO2 is mainly coming, or 50% of CO2 is coming from electricity, we need to accelerate energy transition. If not, there's no way other sectors, other high-emitting sectors can decarbonize. You know, given electricity is basically ingredient for all sectors, as we heard from Humphrey. You know, any activities that you do, whether individual or corporate, you need electricity. And when electricity is, you know, brown, produced using fossil fuel, it will be very, very challenging for you to decarbonize your operation. So that's why energy transition is important, and that's why when we heard about this JETP, of course, working very closely with ADB on this, we thought this is the type of project that we need to be engaged in. And we are deeply involved in Indonesia JETP, Vietnam, but recently, Senegal JETP was launched, I think it was 3-4 months ago during the Macron summit in Paris. So we're not just talking about Asia. We're also, of course, you know, we haven't been able to cover, you know, entire Africa or entire Asia, but we're trying to develop a template. So once the template is there, we will be able to use this template for other countries. So that's where we are on JETP. I want to just briefly talk about two aspects in the context of energy transition. So first of all, we always talk about renewables. Yes, we are a huge financier for renewable, but in some countries, there is overcapacity of coal power plants. So investing in renewable will not solve the entire problem. You need to phase out coal power plants, and then invest in renewable, as opposed to just thinking about renewable. But that's the most challenging bit. And I don't know whether Andrew wants to touch on this, but this is the type of real practical challenge that's facing us, right? There's coal power plants producing electricity for the daily economic activities of individuals and corporates every day, and that is required for the moment. However, you need to shift from fossil fuel to renewable if we think about the 1.5 degrees. So how can we create this just an orderly transition? It's easy to say let's shut down coal and invest in renewable right away. True. But again, what about communities? What about workers? And who's going to invest in, for example, grid, so that renewables can actually replace coal or power plants? So all this have to be comprehensive, grand strategy, as opposed to just talk about one by one. But the figure I want to touch on is there are 5,000 coal power plants in Asia, throughout Asia. That's a defense figure. And we need to reduce that substantially down to, I don't think it will be down to zero, but we need to reduce that amount to a reasonable number in the next 30 years. That means we need to reduce hundreds and hundreds of coal power plants in the next 10 years, every year, right, going forward. And how do we do that? and also thinking about just an orderly transition. That's the practical challenge. So to some extent, what I'm trying to say is criticizing fossil fuel or saying, no, it's bad, is not the solution. We need to come up with more practical solution so that we can reduce our reliance on fossil fuel and increase the cleaner coal. So that's one thing. The other thing I want to discuss in the context of JETP or engaging with emerging economies is CO2 reduction is one part of the equation. But what I often hear from government in ASEAN economies is they want to industrialize. So CO2 reduction, but how do we industrialize while reducing CO2? That is a very complex issue, right? We, in advanced economies, we talk about CO2 reduction, GHG reduction, and of course, it's already a challenging theme for us, but how do you create entire economic ecosystem industrialized in ASEAN countries while reducing CO2? This is a undertaking that nobody in the past have achieved, but that's what JETP is all about. So, of course, this is about energy transition. This is about reducing coal power plants and investing in renewable. But as a result, how can you create a industrialized economy is the bigger agenda that we're trying to achieve. And that's how we are thinking about JETP. And that's why we, private finance, a very important role to play. But ADB, the World Bank, all these multilateral development banks have also a very important role to play so that we together can mobilize massive amount of capital for the purpose of energy transition, but also for the purpose of industrialization. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Great. And actually, I do have a question from the floor, actually, which relates to this, which is sort of to do with how you draw the line. You talked about having a template for JETP. Sort of how you think about drawing the line between supporting growth and giving people the power they need and potentially with fossil fuels versus the decarbonization. How do you think about that line? How do you think about defining that line?
That's a $1 million question. I think all of us are struggling, but I think how we want to think about it would be top down and bottom up. It's easy to say fossil fuel bad, renewable it's good, but when it comes to actual transaction level decision making, it's not that simple, right? How do you phase out coal power plants? How do you share? John, you mentioned about this. How do you distribute burdens, right? Where do you draw the line? Individual transaction level decision making is so complex because we're not government, right? We don't know how other projects are ongoing in renewable space or phasing out other coal power plants. So you need a government level kind of a top-down planning roadmap, or if I may say another way, so that you know where you are, how this energy portfolio is transitioning to cleaner portfolio over the next 5, 10 years, 20 years, so that you can actually position this particular transaction within this larger picture. So bottom up only will probably make it very challenging for you to make it the right decision, but top down only will not actually allow you to execute just an orderly transition. And that's why JETP is important, because we are dealing with the government in Indonesia, Vietnam, and ADB as a very important partner in the context of providing this bigger picture. So that's why we need all hands on deck, as opposed to just individual financial institution coming in and say, okay, we'll finance this one, not that one, because that will not create orderly transition.
Great, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. At a transaction level, it's difficult, so you need a top-down roadmap to help you prioritize your portfolio. Thank you. I'm actually going to move to Andrew as a sort of related question about the ETM and how the ETM tries to balance this sort of growth and decarbonization, which you mentioned in your opening address. So, Andrew, maybe you can explain what the ETM is, and then how that relates to the balancing of growth and decarbonization.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess just quickly to define the ETM, or Energy Transition Mechanism. This is a program that utilizes concessional and commercial capital from various public and private sources to incentivize the early retirement or refurbishing of coal-fired power plants or other carbon-intensive power generation, such as heavy fuel oil, diesel, and the like. But also to unleash new investments in clean energy, grid mobilization, and energy storage. So part of this, and as a multilateral development bank committed to a just transition and addressing some of the livelihood changes that will occur during the transition is very important. But to get to that balance, it's as just previously pointed out, it's a very difficult balance. These countries have very fast-growing electricity demand, and that's twofold. Just one, their economies are growing very fast, but two, as their people get pulled out of poverty, as their people's incomes improve, their use of energy increases. It's really that simple. And if you look at, carbon emissions or energy use on a per capita basis, these countries are much smaller footprints than the developed world. So, they have a point when they say, listen, you're asking us to decarbonize, but, we need help. It's an additional challenge to do so. So, retiring early coal-fired power plants is an additional difficulty in certain regions of the Asia Pacific, because the average age of these coal plants is much younger. The average age in Southeast Asia and some other economies is 13, 14 years for these coal-fired power plants. They have useful lives of, a rule of thumb, useful life is 40 years. With some investment and refurbishment, a coal plant can operate for 50 years, 60 years. Whereas the average life of coal plants in Western Europe or the US, Canada, or North America is, over 40 years. So those plants are close to the end of their lives anyway, economically much easier to retire them. Whereas a plant that's 10 years old that has, was $1 billion had been invested in that plant as a low-cost provider of baseload electricity to a poor country with, extreme, energy demand needs, that was built 10 or 12 years ago. How do you talk to them about retiring it? So we're trying to address that in several ways. First of all, an independent power plant, they have a contractual right to own and operate their plant until the end of their power purchase agreement period, which may be 20 or more years from now. So that's where we're trying to come up with a blend of concessional and commercial priced lending to kind of refinance these projects and incentivize, make it not quite, but more or less return neutral, and in return, shorten the lives of these plants so that they can, retire early. And then the emission savings, which is considerable, is out in those outer years in the shortened PPA period, as well as the period beyond the PPA when they still have useful lives left, but from these plants. But, that has to be coupled with a program that's also within a country to be replacing that power with, cleaner energy sources. So it's you can look at it from a individual plant or project point of view, but you also need to look at it from the overall country systemic point of view. And again, we're trying to work with private sector lenders such as MUFJ and others to, come up with solutions where we can provide attractive financing packages to on the incentivized early retirement side, but also on the supply renewable energy or side to make sure that we address valid concerns of power availability in a fast-growing economy and ample power supply.
Great. Okay, so that makes sense. So sort of to refinance, to shorten the life of some of these power plants, and then invest in the replacement, because obviously to transition, you have to have something to transition onto. And then again, looking at it not on a sort of plant by plant, but as a program, as a sort of joined up, coordinated program. Okay, thank you very much for that. And then again, on the theme of sort of sectors, Eija, I was going to ask about, so Europe has many developed sectors. Some parts of Europe have highly developed coal sectors and still rely a lot on coal. Other countries are in various states of transition. How has Europe sort of started to think about fairness across sectors? How has that been debated at a sort of European level in terms of the approach to those sectors?
Well, that's a good question, very good. And I have to remind you that this morning we heard about European measures. And it's easy to say that we reached our targets. Yes, in a way we did, but it was on the area of production. But if we take into account the consumption, we did not reach our targets. During our climate measures, we actually increased our emissions if the consumption is taken into account, and this meant, of course, that our domestic measures were partly annulled by more imported goods from other countries.
So,
and
yeah, so that was the leakage, the carbon leakage.
That is the dilemma behind everything. And I think that some kind of sectoral thinking and sectoral targets for different production areas of production would be very important in this respect. And actually, I think that the Japanese were the first ones, if I think of climate history and climate debates, they were proposing sectoral thinking on different areas as a solution.
Yeah, and do you think European companies are with their Scope 3 hats on, are thinking about the emissions from their supply chain? Do you think that will drive through incentives for decarbonization sort of further across the supply chain? Do you think that'll be one way to close the circle, if you like?
Well, I think that would be a good basis for fair measures that would really give results as well.
Okay, so that seems to be the way sort of Europe is heading. So, Humphrey, just a question too around, because you mentioned more jobs and the promise of more clean jobs versus sort of more traditional fossil fuel jobs. How do you think in your country are those jobs viewed? Because I know sometimes historically there's been questions about how effective renewable power is and those kind of things versus the historic role of coal and those kinds of things. I suppose, what's the view of different sectors for young people who want jobs? How do people think about that?
Okay, thank you so much. In Tanzania, we have kind of energy mix in terms of electricity generation, whereby almost like 68 comes from natural gas and 32 comes from hydroelectric power. However, the infrastructures which are used to convert natural gas to electricity are not that sophisticated enough to generate enough power. So we likely mostly rely on the ones that are converting hydroelectric. And the status quo is not satisfying because still the country operates under power shortage. And when you speak to young people about issues of energy, they are never interested. They are never interested because it's like, what is it in for me? If we already have our elders who are in the space, in the energy space, but still our country runs out of energy, lacks energy, how can I be interested to go in? But they never consider that the country has other untapped resources. Tanzania has untapped resources in geothermal. It has untapped resources in nuclear because we have uranium minerals in our country. Also, 20% of fresh water in the world is found in Tanzania, 20%. Because we are bestowed with largest lake, Lake Victoria. We do also have Lake Tanganyika, which is the deepest lake in the world. And we have a lot of rivers and underground water. These are resources which are not tapped. And for young people to realize the potential, they firstly need capacity. Africa, as most of the other Tanzania as among other many more African countries, we literally view climate change mostly as a problem, but never as an opportunity. So if I interview 10 people from Tanzania, what is climate change? They will speak negative about it. It's only a single person can say, okay, despite extreme weather events, despite droughts, floods, famine, but there are still opportunities in renewable energy, policy and advocacy. Young people never they don't have these skills and knowledge, of which this gives me like a spotlight to increase capacity of young people. It was in June where I was privileged to attend SB 58, the subsidiary bodies meeting in Bonn, Germany. I was also privileged to be in the negotiations, and also as young as younger generations, we had our event about action for climate empowerment, whereby we emphasized that in order to make young people interested in taking the cause of climate change, we have to incentivize it. In Tanzania now, we are taking a lot of projects in clean cooking. People should not cut trees, we should use natural gas, we should use electric cookers, and so many others. But how can you incentivize that? Because firewood, the supply chain of firewood employs not less than 15 people, to mention those who are carrying the charcoal from one area to another, those who are cutting trees. When you tell them, stop, switch to natural gas, how are you compensating? So among the policies which our country is initiating and is also striving to do is to make sure that community becomes part of the solution and they get incentivized, of which this is like a call of invite to Tanzania. We also have a lot of potential in carbon credit, of which our country, I think it's among the first countries in Africa to have clear regulations on how we can tap the resources in carbon credit. You are welcome to invest there, investing in young people, because there is a lot of potential that they have within them. I can rest here for my case.
Thank you very much. A very good point about climate being seen as a problem, not an opportunity. And we know definitely with our clients, we talk about opportunities because that's what motivates people positively rather than sort of risks and downsides. I'm a little bit conscious of time. So Yumi, I'm just going to ask one more question to you, actually, in terms of you're looking across many countries and across many different topics with your study on sustainability. Where would you put sort of the opportunity side of it? How do you see that as being a key element and something that sort of engages, across the different areas, or yeah, how do you position opportunity, and how do you think about that topic?
Yeah, thank you very much. And actually, at the beginning of my initial statement, I mentioned about this sad news about this 15% achievement of the SDGs. Well, provided this is a fact, that we are facing, I think the only solution right now is two. To promoting the SDGs by 2030. One is the localizing those SDG activities, but second, really to explore where the synergy arises. So if we are trying to tackle those issues related to the each 17 the goals separately, and definitely the achievement is going to be the minimum. Okay, so I think it is very important to find out where the different SDG goals can integrate together to make an action in a society by the different stakeholders. The other one is the connecting the research, the outcome to the educating the next generation. Because at the United Nations University, we don't really conduct the research for the sake of the research, but research for influencing the policy dialogue or the policy, the formulation. So that's the, we have 4 major areas of the expertise in climate action, local governance, water resource management, biodiversity, and education technology. But I think it is very important that we integrate those expertise, between the research areas, but also the research and education together. Okay, so I do hope that would influence for the accelerating the activities, the promoting the achievement of the SDGs. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea that the SDGs, in much of the work that we do, the SDGs are not used and not mentioned, and sort of a lot of economic theory about change, but very rarely linked to SDGs. So interesting point. Maybe that's one way of making sure that the just transition is baked into people's thinking, but also they're positive goals, right? They're also sort of good goals that people can think positively about, rather than sort of pure transition goals. So that's very interesting. So Dr. Lee, I'm going to turn to you now. We have the last 10 minutes. We've covered lots of different topics, and hopefully it's stimulated some thoughts that you may have that you may want to share with us.
Thank you very much. Excellent moderation and excellent presentations, and also discussions, and enjoyed very much. And I've noticed that the number of participants in this room somewhat much less than the number of participants we had in the morning plenary or previous plenary. And I thought of why is that so? I found the answer. We have a concurrent session going on, and the topic of the concurrent session is CDR. So my interpretation is a number of people believe that limiting warming to 1.5, it's probably beyond our capability. So CDR must be the option we must know much better than all other the topics. Well, that's my humble interpretation. But transition toward the net zero is important, and we must put every effort to achieve that goal. Now, let me begin with all the interventions are fantastic, and I get a feeling that the just transition, does that mean the transition is unjust? That means if that is so, then carbon neutrality is unjust. So, somehow, I think we need to give some thought about the word just transition. Now, the background of just transition is, to me, is a very direct. There is a sector that can be adversely affected by this transition away from fossil fuel. Therefore, the sectors affected by this transition, people or some assets, has to be considered. Now, let me tell you this, every country loaded with fossil fuel resources investment are concerned about this transition, concerned about how to handle this rapid transition. If the transition occurs, as one of the panelists mentions, in an orderly way, then that will not be much of a concern. But the speed is a big burden on us. Every country knows how to address this adverse effect on the coal sector. If not, then their regime is in danger. So I don't think this how to help the specific sector is not really a matter for the global discussion, because every country knows how to handle. Now, then what is really important in this discussion? It is the access to this new technology. Transition means we are going away from the traditional technology to a new one. In this case, we have carbon-free energy. Therefore, I think it's very important that no one is left behind to get affordable access to this carbon-free energy. So inclusiveness in this sense, just transition, inclusive in this sense means not only in terms of people, but also in terms of technology. All those technologies that are carbon neutral, that will be carbon neutral, should be welcomed in this process. Now, the second point is related to the just or unjust. We all know that when we try to fix the problem using technology, it creates problem, unintended or reasonably guessed problems. Technology creates its own problems in the context of solving problems. And then we fix another, and then we fix that problem with finding another technologies. Interesting thing is that when we move away from one problem to another problem through this new technology, there will be huge inequality generated. With that inequality, we have a new power of economic power concentrated in a few hands. Now, this is not just a new thing, and history is loaded with such examples. This is a systemic inequality. Now, how to handle that, address the systemic inequality, that's certainly beyond the scope of this discussion, beyond the scope of climate policy domain. But I think I have the answer, but this is not the avenue to discuss that. But we have to recognize that there's a systemic risk, systemic unjustness in terms of technology solution, in terms of just transition in the carbon neutrality. It's a rather minor, but minor in a sense that every country knows how to handle that because it is in their own interest to solve their problems. Now, my next point is, one of our panelists mentioned consumption-based emission, very, very important concept. IPCC report, the SYR, that just released several months ago, there's one table which was not really captured at all, but very, very important table. It shows a ratio of consumption-based emission over production-based emission across the regions. That ratio, consumption over production emission base, were over 1 for countries in Europe, Japan, and for countries in North America. They rely on imports of the various goods. Fine. What that implies is that if those countries impose carbon tax border adjustment, I think that would be unjust unless the revenues from that carbon border tax adjustment is recycled back to the developing countries who produce all those products for export to the other regions. That's the way to fulfill the promises made those countries toward the carbon neutrality. I don't have to repeat what those promises are. Now, the last point I want to see is that we all know that it's a very important finding. The SDG achievement is way behind. mentioned 13%, only 15%, right. Now, so we really have to address that. The interesting point I found this morning was that the ESG, the analysis portfolio, performance of ESG funds somehow performed better than other portfolios, not considering the ESG. And then if we put those things together, I do not have difficulty in understanding why SDGs is falling. Because the profitability, expectation of profit should be better, those funds for following ESG. And then our report, IPCC's report, indicated that there's a tremendous, all of you mentioned the tremendous gap in financing, especially for adaptation financing. And we found 3 to 6 times more investment needed to achieve the carbon neutrality. Now, the question is, why such a gap? Why such a gap? Every project we can think of, not only in climate, but in other segments, there's always talk about the capital shortage. But in the end, the shortage, this mismatch between supply and demand capital, it's a normal thing. And the market will come to adjust those differences in supply and demand and then come to a equilibrium. Now, that means that there is not much investable projects in the climate area, climate response areas from the point of view of holding, from the point of view of investors, potential investors. So that is, then the answer is how the policymakers can resolve that problems. That's where the policy will play an important role. And I believe that's where the governments plays important roles. So many times I have observed that governments tend to take a somewhat non-committal, sometimes non-committal attitude in saying that, gee, private sector's intervention is important, and everybody contributed to this effort to achieve carbon neutrality. Fine, but without government leading the charge, nothing will happen. I want to emphasize that. It is the government problem because carbon emission is a failure of the market system, and only the public sector government can solve the problems. Session is very informative and very insightful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to everybody on screen, Tomo and Andrew as well. Thank you very much.